All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you all are. I'm going to get started sooner rather than later since we have a lot of material to cover. And as you may have seen, this session is being recorded. So for those who jump on later or who have to leave early, we'll hopefully be able to share this out as a resource, beyond just the next hour. So welcome, everybody. I am Ramya Ravishankar, the General Counsel of HowGood. I am an environmental biologist turned lawyer with a long history of working in regulatory enforcement. I helped companies before my time at HowGood abide by a variety of regulations, and I helped mitigate the fallout and damages of noncompliance. Before I joined HowGood, I was at another food CPG company. So like many of you, I was on the other side of this question, navigating what my company needed to do in the face of a changing regulatory environment. And I enjoy the intersection of food and sustainability. So I wanted to bring that expertise and that interest to HowGood, where I came on about a year ago. HowGood is an independent research company and a SaaS data platform, as many of you know, and we actually host the world's largest database on food product sustainability, with more than 33,000 ingredients, chemicals, and materials that we have assessed. And with that expertise, we've actually helped some of the world's largest food brands, retailers, suppliers, and food service providers measure, manage, and communicate their sustainability impact. But as any good lawyer would say to you before we get started on today's talk around regulatory trends and sustainability, I'm going to start off with a disclaimer slide. And pardon me if you have seen this before, but this is sort of stock with my talks. I'll give everyone a moment to read it, but in essence, I just want to reiterate, I am not representing you or providing you with legal advice. Any content that you are listening to or relying on from this presentation, you should independently vet with your own counsel. And, we're presenting this as is. Things are constantly changing on the ground. So even if it may be true today, it may not be true tomorrow. So we just want to make sure you're all aware of that. So I'll give everybody a couple seconds to digest this slide, and then we'll actually move to the meat of the matter today. All right. So our agenda for today, we're going to start off with some table setting, pardon the food pun, but we'll talk about the context and the background in which we are operating. We'll focus on some key American regulations, specifically the SEC climate disclosure rules, the FAR Council climate disclosure rules, as well as the request for information and updates to the FTC's green guides. We'll talk about some key EU regulations, in particular the recently passed EU deforestation regulation, as well as the proposed Green Claims Directive, as well as the Green Transition Directive. We'll focus on some other global trends and then wrap up with some Q&A. And please don't wait till the end. If there are questions that you think of over the course of the conversation, I encourage you to submit it to the chat. We have moderators waiting to share some of those questions with me that I can then use the Q&A time at the end to address. All right, let's get started. So why are we here? Food and beverage companies are at the forefront of climate management issues, especially given agriculture's outsized role in its impact on the environment. And for us at HowGood, as a sustainability intelligence platform supporting food companies, part of our competitive advantage is keeping abreast of regulatory changes and requirements, and thereby determining how we can best support our customers, not only be aware of these regulatory trends and changes, but also help them comply with these requirements. And many of our customers and prospects at this point in the year are planning for the next 12 months, whether it's via budget or investment in terms of human capital, or even just setting their strategies. So we've gotten a lot of questions around what the state of play is in the sustainability regulation space. And we thought it would be a good time now to explore some of those questions and explore some of these key existing and forthcoming regulations so that you can think about the most important priorities that you need to focus on as you prepare and plan. In terms of the state of the global sustainability regulatory landscape, it is one that is changing quite rapidly. And one of the things that's challenging about it is that it's a nascent field and it hasn't developed systematically, but rather in a very ad hoc and reactionary manner. So sometimes changes that are cropping up can seem a little frenetic. And the particularly nuanced finding here is that sometimes the changes are promulgated by governments, sometimes they are grassroots and a result of existing business practices. So we haven't had a central ESG regulatory body that's sort of governing how sustainability is regulated across the world, and rules and regulations are being written as we go. That obviously makes planning and predicting a little bit more difficult. So we thought we would try and make sense of some of that complexity in our talk today. In terms of what's at stake, there's no real determined metric for success. As these frameworks and these regulations come up, we're seeing iterative ways in which both regulatory bodies and companies operating in these jurisdictions are adapting and succeeding. And we're reaching a point where, especially in the US, for example, bodies like the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, or the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, are trying to introduce metrics, and they're trying to increase data transparency and harmonizing the way companies operate and communicate to end consumers. We're also seeing a greater crackdown on misinformation, on what's considered greenwashing, so hyperbolized or unsubstantiated marketing claims that speak to an entity's sustainability bona fides. But as this landscape starts to mature, we, as an industry and also, companies operating in this regulatory space, need to take time to figure out, what does ESG really mean to us? How can we show up authentically and live our commitment to ESG? And how can we do that without running afoul of regulations? But there's all kinds of opportunities coming up for us to be able to do that. So you may have picked up on this a little bit in what I just said, but just to reiterate, there are two key trends I'm seeing in this space and that we will focus on for this conversation. The first is there's increased disclosure requirements that are being imposed top-down by regulators. So this is regulatory disclosure requirements around companies' ESG impacts, particularly around their carbon impacts and their GHG emissions more generally. And then the second trend we're seeing is regulations around what actually can be communicated externally and how it's substantiated. So this is coming in the form of enforcement actions, in the form of more guidance and more prescriptive frameworks around how ESG commitments can be shared more broadly. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the key American regulations. Like I mentioned, the focus of this conversation will be the SEC's proposed climate disclosure rules and the Counsel's climate disclosure rules, as well as the FTC's Green Guide updates. The first two happen to fall into that first category of increased disclosure. And then the second is more around what can be communicated and how. So with the SEC's climate disclosure rules, there's been a lot of attention in this space, just given how widespread its impact would be. The SEC regulates public companies and issuers of securities. And back in March of 2022, they proposed that there would be increased climate disclosure attached to public companies' financial statements. So they would need to include any material climate-related risks to their business. And it would include disclosure around greenhouse gas emissions, because that is such a common proxy or commonly used metric to determine exposure to climate-related risks. And this is a proposed regulation. And in the US, anytime an agency, for example, here the SEC, is proposing a regulation or a rule, it can't just issue it and now everybody has to comply. It actually opens it up for a public comment period. And during the public comment period, it received almost 15,000 comments from a wide variety of stakeholders. And many of the comments celebrated this increased transparency around climate and equating climate risk to financial risk. However, there's also been a lot of pushback around the SEC's ability to even regulate in this space. The pushback has come from, traditionally resource-intensive and extractive industries, as you can imagine, but it's also come from large companies for whom the type of undertaking it would involve in order to comply would be quite large. In fact, there's been a lot of pushback around the fact that Scope 3 emissions, which are downstream emissions from the supply chain, would be really hard to gather data around, or it would be really granular. There's been a lot of pushback around how much time and investment it would require. There's been a lot of pushback around whether the current presidential administration is trying to shoehorn social and climate priorities through the mechanism of a financial regulator. So there's been a lot of conversation around it. However, we do expect a final rule around this to come out this fall. There's been some rumors suggesting it could come out as early as next week during Climate Week, but if I was a betting woman, I would expect it would probably be later this year, sometime in late October, where the SEC will have digested all of this feedback and adjusted the rule based on the feedback and proposed something that still addresses their priorities, but maybe not in quite so many words as the proposal had initially suggested. So we expect there will be something in this space, and after it is finalized, there will be a period of phasing in for companies to comply. And I also wouldn't be surprised if there's constitutional challenges or other legal challenges to the SEC promulgating this rule. But whether or not the final rule moves forward in whatever form it is introduced in later this year, the stage has already been set for other US regulators and lawmakers to make such disclosure requirements mandatory for businesses operating in those jurisdictions. A quick example for you is actually in California. There's currently a bill before the California Senate, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, which requires certain large companies that operate in California to disclose Scope 1 and 2 emissions starting in 2026, and then mandatory Scope 3 emissions reporting in 2027. And it doesn't matter if you're a California-based company or not, but if you have a revenue, if you cross the revenue threshold of $1 billion or more, and you operate in some way in California, you would be pulled into the scope of this law. And this has had a lot of industry support in California from companies like Adobe, Microsoft, and other big players. And given the climate forward nature of the lawmakers there, it is expected that in the next session that this becomes the law. So no matter what the details are, whether it's through the SEC or through some of these other regulators, what we're expecting is some sort of phase-in period by which large companies, and in some cases even small companies, will have to take more stock of their greenhouse gas emissions impacts and reporting. The other proposed rule that touches on the same type of subject matter but hasn't gotten as much attention is the Counsel's proposed climate disclosure rules. The Counsel is a group of US federal agencies that are responsible for determining what kind of procurement the US government can engage in and what parameters they will evaluate prospective contractors under. And late last year, they introduced a proposal that in some ways mirrors the SEC's disclosure requirements, but in some other ways goes beyond those disclosure requirements for any government contractors who are engaging with the US government. And this may apply to some of you, and it may not to others, but it is something to keep in mind if you're thinking about how else you're going to be expanding your market or how you're leveraging your relationships with your suppliers and your customers who in turn might have some sort of nexus to the US federal government. The rule would require, again, scope 1 and scope 2 disclosures, depending on the size of contractor you are. And the size is determined based on the amount of federal funding you get, whether it is through contracts, whether it's through grants, whether it's through some other through some other mechanism. And beyond scope 1 and 2, if you're a particularly large contractor, you would even be required to submit scope 3 disclosures. And what's more is for these particularly large contractors, and this is the part where the FAR Council's proposal goes above and beyond the SEC's, these contractors would have to submit a climate change questionnaire that has been developed by the CDP, and also set science-based targets that go on to reduce their impact over the course of a set number of years. Again, this is also in proposal stage, and like the SEC's proposal, this also received actually even more comments, almost 40,000, that the FAR Council is going through. And we expect, it'd be optimistic to think later this year that the rule is finalized, but more likely sometime early next year. And once that rule has been finalized, companies will have at least a year to collect the data they need and, create complete the questionnaires they need to fill out and disclose all of the relevant emissions. In terms of how companies who are impacted by this can prepare, they can first, determine what touch points they have with the US federal government, what tier of contractor they would be under this proposal based on the amount of money they are receiving from the federal government. And then once you've determined that, you can start taking steps in terms of ensuring you're able to accurately and quickly disclose the relevant data by the time you have to, a year's time after the rule goes into final, once the rule is finalized. In the meantime, you may already have certain types of data that is readily available. And perhaps you are going to look at, what areas in your supply chain you need greater visibility over, or what types of data do you need more granularity over, and you can make you can triage and make a risk assessment based on that. The fact that this is a disclosure obligation that contractors have to abide by means that with this proposal being finalized, if you're not following it, you're just out of the running for government contracts, which for many companies can be a big source of income. So the implications of non-compliance can be quite large. And if you were to submit inaccurate disclosures, you would have you would be subject to whistleblower allegations, fraud allegations. You could companies could be subject to fines, as well as contract cancellation, possible suspension, debarment, the list goes on. So this is, even though it hasn't gotten the same sort of public attention as the SEC's climate disclosure rules have, it does have a significant impact for a large number of companies. And then the last area that I wanted to focus on when we're talking about American regulations is around that category of what can be said publicly and how it's substantiated. And that comes in the form of the Federal Trade Commission's Green Guides updates. So the Federal Trade Commission is a consumer protection watchdog agency. And among the things it is responsible for are advertising and marketing risks. And since the early 90s, this agency has issued what are considered green guides, which are guidance documents that outline how sustainability marketing claims can be made without being deceptive to the end consumer. And the guides have been updated periodically over the years. The last update was in 2012. And what happened in late last year was the FTC asked for a request for information. They wanted to understand if the guides were even relevant to end users, whether it's companies or consumers like you or I. And they wanted to understand if it is still relevant, what are some things that could be made better given the changes in the sustainability landscape, both from a immediacy of impact perspective, but also from a sophistication of consumer knowledge and consumption perspective. The guides, as they currently stand, don't have the force of agency regulation. They're not enforced. Rather, they basically set the standard for how the FTC determines what is unfair or deceptive, and then can be used by regulators to then bring false advertising claims. But the guides in and of themselves don't have the force of law. So over 7,000 comments were submitted in response to this request for information. Full disclosure, HowGood also submitted our thoughts in a public comment. And based on a cursory review of these thousands of comments, it's clear that there is a continuing need for these guides. And in fact, there's a lot of appetite for strengthening the guides, clarifying the guides, maybe even giving the guides some sort of legal apparatus through which enforcement can be done. And given that this is still only a request for information, the FTC is going to digest all of the feedback it has received. And one of two things can really happen. They could issue an updated set of guides based on the comments, or, and this is what I think is more likely, they could turn the guides into an actual regulation. And for that, they would again have to submit a proposed regulation down the road, probably sometime early 2024, have those proposed words or phrasings reviewed by the public for another round of comments, and then finalize that regulation into an enforceable rule. So in terms of what companies can do to stay abreast of this, there's still a lot of time before we see something finalized and with teeth. But continuing to maintain the principles of the guides when making your marketing claims is a really good place to start. So having clear, credible evidence to back up the claims you're making, not overstating an environmental benefit when, taken as a whole, the product you're marketing may not be so great, or not communicating a message with images or context that doesn't line up with the words on the page, all the kind of principles that you have seen in the current version of the guides, I would continue to abide by and monitor commentary in the space on how likely the guides are to be updated versus a new rule that concretizes the enforcement of them. Moving on, the EU. So I thought I'd spend, just as much real estate talking about the European Union as I have the US. I mean, certainly as a US company, we pay a lot of attention to US regulations, but the EU is in some ways even more compelling in changing the course of sustainability regulations. There is the European Green Deal that the current European Parliament is focused on expanding. So there's been a slew of proposals and finalized legislation coming out of this jurisdiction. And certainly, given the market share and the market potential of the EU, a lot of companies are sitting up and taking notice. Whether the US or any other country is following suit or not, the weight of the EU's sustainability priorities and directions has had an impact on how businesses are operating. So I wanted to focus on three key finalized or proposed regulations. One is the European Deforestation Regulation. This falls under that first trend or bucket I mentioned around greater disclosure obligations. And then I wanted to look at two proposed directives from the EU. One is called the Green Claims Directive for short, and one is called the Green Transition Directive. And these are still far from being finalized, but touch so heavily on some of the topics we're talking about that it would be really critical in any analysis or reflection of the regulatory space to consider them as well. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, for those non-European or non-EU experts out there, and I certainly am not one, I over time have learned the nuances of this. The way lawmaking works in the EU is you have the European Commission that puts together these draft directives, which then go through a commenting and editing and finalizing process between the European Parliament and the European Council. So these three bodies come together and finalize what would then be adopted as an EU directive. And once they've formalized and approved that, the respective EU member states then have some time and leeway to take the meat of that directive and adopt it within their own national laws. So each of these regulations that we're going to be talking about are in different sort of stages in that entire network process. So we'll talk through the nuances and what that actually means in terms of compliance. So the first is the deforestation regulation. This actually came into force June 2023 at the EU level, and member states now have some time to adopt that into their national laws. And companies that are affected by this regulation will be required to comply, starting December 30th, 2024. So effectively in the beginning of 2025. And the companies that are impacted by this are any producers or importers of commodities involving cattle, cocoa, coffee, oil palm, rubber, soya, and wood. And in order to comply with this regulation, they're going to need to conduct extensive diligence on their supply chain to ensure that the goods that are being produced are not the result of deforestation from the last 3 years. So basically, post-2020 deforestation, forest degradation, or breaches of local environment and social laws. So what does that mean? These companies need to ensure that their products have been produced using land that has not been converted from forest to agricultural use, whether that forced change has been human-induced or not. And what's particularly nuanced about this is the EU is agnostic to whether that deforestation was legal or not in the country where it happened. So as long as the product was made by growing it on land that was converted from forest to agricultural use, it would run afoul of this rule. And in order to comply, the companies not only have to make sure that their supply chain is free of this type of land use change, they also have to submit a due diligence questionnaire, and they have to submit data around their downstream suppliers. And it goes down to a great level of granularity, down to the individual plots of land from which they're sourcing their materials. So we would recommend companies that are impacted by this look at that questionnaire to understand what kind of information is being sought and what's in scope. What areas do they not have information in so that they can disclaim that and be clear about that? And figure out a risk assessment in terms of quantifying how much information do we not have against what it would cost us for not complying and not having that information. And then once you've done that, working through some sort of independent survey or audit where you can gather additional information at the ground level, work with your suppliers, invest in your suppliers so that they can gather data if they haven't already, so that you're ready in a year's time or 2 years' time to be able to comply with this regulation. the reason this is so important, it's actually a couple things. One, even though companies will have to comply starting in 2025, the products that are going to be in the ambit of this rule are products that are being manufactured now. So you want to start gathering your data and doing these sort of gap analyses now for whatever products you're manufacturing that will enter the EU market starting in 2025. So that when you're reporting out, you're able to say you've done all of this and you can ensure that your products are deforestation free. And you should check what of your product portfolio really is covered by this regulation. Because even though the commodities covered are cattle, cocoa, palm oil, so on and so forth, certain derivatives or certain products that use those ingredients are not covered by the regulation. So a good example is soap that might have palm oil as an ingredient. That is specifically disclaimed as not something that is covered. So your supplier that grows the palm oil, if they're importing into the EU, they might be covered under this regulation. But if all you're doing is manufacturing soap and importing that into the EU, you would not be covered. So I would read through the annex to this deforestation regulation and be very clear on what is covered and how that matches up with your product portfolio to determine if you're in scope or not. And as time goes on, and certainly not more than 2 years from now, the EU will be updating the list in that annex of what's covered. So there may be additional products that are under this regulation's purview. So keeping an eye out for that will also be really important for companies. For example, when this regulation was in its draft stage, those 7 commodities were included, as well as swine, sheep, goats, poultry, and maize. So if you have products that cover or that include ingredients from those categories, you might be particularly watchful for updates, because it could be that they were prioritized enough, but not in tier 1. So they might make it into the list of covered products in round 2. So yeah, that's sort of critical. The other kind of things to consider with this regulation are there's actually a lot on the line for non-compliance. So member states in the EU can do random checks to ensure that companies are complying with the deforestation-free labels. And there can also be private parties who bring action. So if there's a individual consumer somewhere in the EU who suspects that the company making this claim is not quite correct in making that claim, they can bring a private right of action. And then the biggest, most substantial impact of this regulation is actually the type of fines that a company can incur for non-compliance. It can cost a company at least 4% of their annual EU revenue if they are found to be in non-compliance. And that's the floor. It could be higher than 4% of their annual EU revenue. It's just that that's where the minimum is set. And the fines are proportionate to the scope of environmental damage the EU has assessed from that particular line of products and the value of the items. And other sort of key things to consider are the products that are being covered could be confiscated, as well as the revenues gained from that line of products. And for serious and repeated infringements, the company could be banned from operating in the EU altogether. So there's a lot on the line if you come under the scope of this, and given the weight of this regulation, it's really making people sit up and take notice of the EU's priorities in ESG and their enforcement commitments. So in terms of how you can prepare, just in summary, start assessing how complex your supply chain is and how it interweaves with some of these commodities. And if you are finding that some stages of your production or processing are hard to gather data on, conduct a gap analysis and really quantify what kind of investment it's going to take to fix those gaps, and whether the value of operating in the EU is it outweighs the costs of investing in those gap corrections. And get familiar with the laws in the applicable countries where you're sourcing these commodities, so that you can get more data around the land use rights there, the kind of environmental protection that is in scope there, and what kind of international protections the country is abiding by, so on and so forth, and monitor any of the intervening updates in this space from the EU. And then, as I mentioned before, start collecting data where you can now, because the products you're making today will ultimately be in scope when they're being sold in a couple of years' time. All right. So that's already in place. Now I'm going to move over to two sets of proposals in the EU, and both of them fall under the second bucket of how environmental claims can be communicated. So the first one is the Green Claims Directive. It was proposed in March earlier this year, and it has been proposed by the EU Commission and is now going through the Council and the Parliament for revisions and adjustments. And it addresses greenwashing risk by requiring that companies that make sustainability-related claims have those claims substantiated independently and through an externally verified body. And the verification and the substantiation must be supported by scientific evidence that is robust, widely recognized and understood. And if there are any comparisons that are being made in these claims, that such comparisons are fair and based on equivalent data. So you're comparing apples to apples, and you're not cherry picking, to continue the fruit analogy, certain aspects of one product against another. And if this proposal is implemented, it will impose existing obligations on companies beyond just what currently exists in general advertising law in the European Union in terms of not misleading end consumers. The kind of scientific evidence that the companies will need to support their claims with have to take on a full life cycle approach if it's available, and it will need to be made public and available to everybody so that it can be independently verified and substantiated. And if you as a company are making sort of aspirational or mission-oriented targets for improving your environmental impacts and credentials, then you're going to have to commit to a deadline that you complete those aspirations or those obligations by. This rule we expect to be finalized probably by May 2024. So as I mentioned, it is currently with the European Parliament and Council for debate and updates. And the Parliament will be undergoing an election in early June 2024. So we expect this will be brought in and finalized before that election is underway. And once it is finalized in whatever shape it ends up being, the member states in the EU will have 18 months to implement the rule into their national legislative bodies. And the non-compliance risk here is similar to the deforestation regulation in that there will be a minimum 4% fine, or a fine of a minimum of 4% of company revenue, except it will be company revenue in the individual member state where the claim was made. Of course, with larger or more cross-border claims and issues, the scope of the fine, what's on the line, would be greater. And there could also be the risk of being kicked out of participating in public procurement or accessing public funding in the EU. And because this is still in proposal stage, there could be many more consequences for non-compliance as well that get introduced when the rule is finalized. So in terms of how you can prepare, start reviewing what claims you're using in the moment or you want to use, and whether those claims can be backed up by scientific and reliable evidence from a third party, and continue to watch this space, because if you want to be competitive in the EU and you want to lean in on your sustainability bona fides, complying with this directive will be non-negotiable. And then the third directive or proposed directive I would talk about here is the Green Transition Directive. This has not received as much attention recently compared to the Green Claims Directive, but it's actually older. It was proposed in March of the previous year. And in many ways, it actually works in tandem with the Green Claims Directive to curb greenwashing. And what it does is specifically ban certain general environmental claims. So claims around environmentally friendly, eco-friendly, or carbon neutral have been prescribed unless they're part of some sort of eco-labeling scheme that a company is party to. And this also we expect to be passed by May of 2024 before the EU parliamentary elections. And similar to the Green Claims Directive, I'd recommend companies in preparation for compliance do an audit of what claims they already use that might fall under this ban and how they can adjust their claims and marketing strategy so that they are not running afoul of what this directive suggests, and keep an eye out for updates and finalization so that at a moment's notice, you're able to pivot and communicate your environmental bona fides differently without running afoul of this one. Okay. I'm going to spend the last couple minutes of my presentation on global trends before we open it up to Q&A. So, we spoke a lot about the US and the EU, and certainly given their market share and the priorities and impacts of these jurisdictions, it's worth spending time talking about them as much as we have. But it isn't to say they're the only legislative bodies that are moving forward on sustainability regulations and enforcement. We're seeing actually activity tick up all over the world. And I thought I would use this part of the presentation to talk about some of the other areas or parts of the world where we're seeing this in particularly prominent form. So the first is in Australia. Australia has taken on a greater enforcement function around sustainability claims and greenwashing. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which is their consumer watchdog agency, they recently released draft guidance for businesses when they are making environmental and sustainability claims. It's currently open for public consultation. It's still being finalized, but it provides examples around what legal compliance would look like under the ACC's perspective. And similar to the FTC Green Guides, some of the key principles that they have pushed forward are around making truthful, accurate claims, backing them up with reliable scientific evidence, not hiding important information or qualifiers, avoiding broad, sweeping, generalized statements, and using clear, easy to understand language so lay people are not misled. So this suggests that we're going to see more strict scrutiny of greenwashing and potential greenwashing in Australia. In the UK, we're seeing a couple things. We're seeing sustainability disclosure proposals similar to what the SEC and these other regulatory bodies have been issuing for financial products, certainly. So if you're a financial services firm and you're offering ESG-focused financial products, the British Financial Conduct Authority is expected later this year to share guidance on how those products can be communicated or what their benefits can be set as. But they also have started building out their consumer protection capabilities. So they introduced the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill, which is before the Parliament now, that has very clearly addressed greenwashing by name as a policy priority in Britain. And it gives the Competitions and Markets Authority in the country the ability to impose fines as large as 10% of annual global revenue for misleading green claims. So not nothing, right? So if you think about not only the fact that it's 10% and the fact that it's global revenue, the British government is really beefing up its ability to enforce large fines for what it would consider misleading sustainability marketing. And we're not just seeing this in Commonwealth or in European markets. We're seeing them seeing a greater trend towards sustainability in other countries like Singapore and India as well. There's more disclosure requirements in the pipeline, more greenwashing scrutiny on the radars of a lot of regulatory bodies. For example, in India, publicly listed companies are going to have to start reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for fiscal year ending in 2023. And scope 3 emissions are currently voluntary for publicly listed companies there, but it certainly looks like voluntary standards will soon be mandatory standards as time goes on. And in Singapore, there are proposals in place for all public companies, as well as certain private companies with certain financial thresholds, to start sharing their climate-related disclosures as early as 2027. So it would be helpful for companies sort of exploring these markets, or even who are currently operating in these markets, to start thinking about what your climate commitments currently look like and what else you'll need to do to be competitive and be compliant with these new regulations. All right. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and open it up to questions. And I see we've got a bunch, so give me a sec as I go through them. All right. All right, so there was a question asking to clarify the revenue threshold where the California GHG reporting requirements will kick in. Is it $1 billion in the state or nationwide? It's nationwide, so any large company with over $1 billion in revenue that operates in California would come under the purview of this new law. Is the FAR Council a proposal by a third-party group, or is this one under review now by the federal government? Yeah, the FAR Council proposal is a government proposal. So the council is a collection of government agencies that determine what the ground rules are for procurement as a federal government. So they have proposed these parameters around climate disclosure in order to determine what kind of government contracts they engage with. So it's not a private third-party proposal or an industry group proposal. It is what the government is proposing it use as the categories by which it engages in contracting. There's a question specific to HowGood. Are you all tracking the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act around human rights and ethical trading? And the answer is yes, we do have that on our tracker. You know, it's the entire supply chain, not just an individual company's impacts that are under this purview. So with respect to human rights violations, given we do include labor risk and a few other non-environmental risks in our metrics, we do have this on our radar. For US regulations, are the guides to be updated by end of 2023, or could that potentially turn into a regulation? I think I addressed this already. So yeah, just to reiterate, for the green guides, they had asked for a request for information late last year. The comment period closed earlier this year. It was just to understand whether the guides were even relevant. Clearly, there's a lot of appetite to maintain its relevance, and therefore what we're likely to see, instead of just new guides being updated, are the guides being turned into an enforceable set of regulations. All right. All right. Let me see. I've got a few others. Yeah, could you please provide insights into how the TNFD is shaping the landscape of environmental regulations in the US? Thank you. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit beyond just that. The TNFD, or the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is an independent framework that determines what kind of data and information can be incorporated into sound financial disclosures and reporting. And it has become one of the most reliable frameworks that all kinds of regulatory bodies, not just in the US, have relied on to set their standards and their frameworks around regulatory disclosure requirements. So sometimes you'll see specific citation to the TNFD as the model that a company should follow when complying with insert state here's disclosure obligations. All right. Do you see a link between the EU and the UK? What are we expecting? Are we expecting a version of EU regulations to hit the UK? I mean, look, it's a tough question, especially given Brexit and the tensions between the two sets of legal regimes. But what we're seeing are, complementary priorities, both from Britain and the European Union, around protecting the environment and sustainability commitments. So whether or not they explicitly cite each other, what we're seeing are trends that are very much parallel, where there is increased disclosure requirements, increased greenwashing enforcement, and increased financial penalties for noncompliance. And my question mark is more around the US, like how quickly do they keep up with both of these two jurisdictions? All right, let's see. For footprint communication, any legalizing rules for product emissions coming in the EU? I would say the closest to this one is the Green Claims Directive. They haven't been prescriptive, and in fact, there was a leaked draft of or an earlier version of the directive, which has since changed from what was sent to the Parliament and the Council. And what you saw was an increasingly unprescriptive way through which the legislative body wants footprint communication or footprint calculation to be done. So to the extent that the EU is regulating or considering this, it'll be in the Green Claims Directive. But it's not clear beyond that what that's going to look like. All right, I think I've gone through most of the other questions. All right, so I think I'm gonna take this time to wrap up and say thank you all for the engaging discussion. HowGood, like I said, it is part of our value proposition to stay abreast of trends and updates in this space so that we can be better partners for many of you in supplying the data or identifying the gaps in your supply chains. We are continuing to improve on that capability. So we are actually also going to have a webinar in the coming days around flag guidance and how it impacts your operations. And that talk will be on September 28th. I think a link will be shared in the chat shortly. And for those of you who are joining us in New York for Climate Week, we look forward to speaking to you and interacting more then. So thank you all for the very engaging conversation, and we'll speak to you all very soon.